Sri Ramana says that only this state of just being can be called jnana drishti, or the experience of true knowledge. The Sanskrit word jnana, which is derived from the verbal root jna, meaning to know, to cognize, or to experience, means knowing or knowledge, and in a spiritual context it means true knowledge. That is, knowledge of our own real self. The Sanskrit word drishti means the act of seeing, beholding, or looking at, or the faculty of sight, the eye, a look, a glance, or a view. Thus, the compound word jnana drishti means the seeing or experience of true knowledge. Therefore, since the experience of true knowledge is nothing other than the experience of knowing our own real self, and since we know our real self only by being nothing other than our real self, the state of just being what we always really are is the experience of true self-knowledge, or jnana drishti. In the popular imagination, however, the term jnana drishti is wrongly believed to mean the power or ability to know certain things that could not normally be known by the human mind, such as what other people are thinking, what will happen in the future, or what is happening in some faraway place. But such miraculous or supernatural powers do not in fact have anything to do with true knowledge. On the contrary, they are merely additional forms of ignorance, delusion, or self-deception. Forms of delusion that only add to the density of our already existing and deeply rooted delusion about who or what we really are. Since our mind has created this entire universe by the power of its imagination, there would be nothing that it could not do if only it could master complete control over its imagination. However, since our power of imagination is a power of delusion and self-deception, we can never master it perfectly. If we try to control it in one way, it will deceive us in some other way. Nevertheless, since our mind is so powerful, it is possible for us to manipulate our power of imagination by certain techniques, such as certain forms of meditation, concentrated repetition of certain mantras or sounds that are supposedly endowed with some mystical power, certain yogic practices, occult rites and rituals, carefully controlled use of certain entheogenic or so-called mind-expanding herbs, fungi, or other drugs, certain other forms of magic that supposedly enable a person to invoke the aid of spirits, jinn, demons, angels, petty deities, or devas, or some other such artificial means, in such a way as to delude ourselves and others into believing that we possess certain miraculous powers. Just as in dream we are able to manipulate our power of imagination in such a way as to delude ourselves into believing that we are actually flying. However, since the world we see in this waking state is no more real than the world we see in a dream, any miraculous powers that we may be able to display in this waking state are no more real than our ability to fly in a dream. Therefore, in verse 35 of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana says, knowing and being the absolute reality, our own essential being, which is eternally siddha, attained, is the only true siddhi, attainment. All other siddhis, attainments such as miraculous powers, are merely like siddhis that we experience in dream. If we consider such siddhis after we have woken up, leaving sleep, will they still appear to us to be real? Consider likewise, will those who have left or ended unreality by experiencing and abiding in the real state of true self-knowledge be deluded by the deceptive illusion of miraculous powers? Whatever we experience in a dream appears to us to be real only so long as we are experiencing that dream. When we wake up and consider what we had experienced, we understand clearly and without any doubt that it was all unreal, being merely a figment of our imagination. Likewise, all that we experience in this so-called waking state appears to us to be real, only so long as we are experiencing this state. When we wake up into our real waking state, which is the non-dual state of perfectly clear self-consciousness or self-knowledge, we will discover that all the duality that we are now experiencing in our present state of self-ignorance is as unreal as all the duality that we experienced in our dream, being nothing but a mere figment of our own imagination. When we clearly know ourselves as we really are, that is, as our non-dual consciousness of our own essential being I am, which is the one and only absolute reality, we will discover that we alone are real, and that everything that formerly appeared to be other than ourself is therefore entirely unreal. Experiencing and abiding firmly in this state of absolute clarity is therefore the only attainment or siddhi that is truly worth achieving. By achieving this self-attainment or atma-siddhi, we will free ourselves from the delusion that we are this mind, the false, finite form of consciousness that imagines itself to be experiencing duality or otherness, and thereby we will transcend all our present imaginary knowledge of otherness. Having thus discarded the entire fabrication of duality, will we be deluded by any appearance such as the display of miraculous powers? If we understand that this whole world is a mere dream, we will find no wonder and take no delight in miracles or any such display of supernatural power. Miracles happen according to people's faith in them, and such faith is nothing but an act of imagination. We are only able to fly in a dream because at that time we believe that we can fly. If we did not believe that we could fly, we would not even attempt to do so. Similarly, we would not look for miracles in this world if we did not believe that miracles were possible. If we see a miracle, we must have already believed, either consciously or unconsciously, that such a miracle is possible. We may attribute such miracles to some form of divine agency, but in fact they are nothing but a product of our own imagination, just as this whole world is a product of our own imagination. Therefore, if we have understood at least theoretically that all knowledge of duality or otherness is merely a figment of our own imagination, like all the knowledge we have of things other than ourselves in a dream, we will feel no desire to acquire any form of supernatural power or to perform any miracle. If we are able to perform miracles, we may be able to delude other people, but by doing so, the first person we would delude is ourself. Therefore, in verse 8 of Upadesa Tanipakal, Sri Ramana says, "A conjurer will delude the people of this world without himself being deluded, my son, but a siddha, a person who has acquired siddhis or miraculous powers, deludes the people of this world and himself also deluded, believing his own powers and miracles to be real." What a wonder this is! Whatever supernatural power of knowing we have, whether the power to know what other people are thinking, the power to know what will happen in the future, or the power to know what is happening in faraway places, such power is only a power to know something other than ourself, and it cannot help us to know ourself. All such powers are therefore only a means of self-deception and cannot be a means to true self-discovery. No knowledge of anything other than ourself can be true knowledge, because all such knowledge is acquired by us through the delusive and self-deceiving consciousness that we call our mind. The only knowledge that is true or real is the correct and uncontaminated knowledge of our own real self. Our essential non-dual consciousness of our own being I am. The knowledge of anything other than I am is merely a form of imagination, and is therefore not really knowledge, but only ignorance. Therefore, if we wish to attain true knowledge, without which we cannot experience true and perfect happiness, we should not waste our time and energy practicing meditation, yoga, or any other occult technique with an aim to acquire any form of supernatural power. Since we know from our own experience in dream that our mind has the power to create an entire world within itself, and since we therefore have to suspect that even this world that we experience in our present waking state is likewise a mere creation of our mind, we know that our mind is already endowed with immeasurable power. However, all the wonderful power of our mind, all its present power and all its potential power, is nothing but the power of our own imagination. Moreover, all such power is only a power of extroversion, a power that is directed outwards, away from ourself, and therefore it only serves to delude us and to obscure from our experience the clarity of true self-consciousness or self-knowledge which always exists in the core of our being. That is, since the outward-going power of our mind, the power of our mind to know anything other than ourself, is the power of Maya, the power of delusion or self-deception, it is the obstacle that stands in the way of our knowing our real self. Hence, if we attempt to increase the outward-going power of our mind in any way, we will merely succeed in increasing the density of our ignorance, the density of the cloud of false knowledge that obscures our ever-existing inner clarity of true self-knowledge. Therefore, in verse 16 of Uladu Narpadu Anubandham, Sri Ramana asks, since absolute peace or calmness of mind alone is mukti, liberation from the bonds of self-ignorance or delusion, which is in truth always attained, tell me, how can those whose minds are bound to the desire for siddhis, supernatural powers of mind, which cannot be attained without activity of mind, immerse in the bliss of mukti, which is completely devoid of movement, oscillation, wavering, or activity of mind? The opening words of this verse, Chittatin Santi, which literally mean peace of mind, denote the state in which our mind has subsided and dissolved in the absolute peace of mere being, which is completely devoid of any kind of movement or activity. Only in that state of absolute peace and calmness can we experience full and perfect clarity of true self-knowledge. This peaceful state of true self-knowledge is often described as being the state of mukti, which means liberation or emancipation, because only true self-knowledge can free us from our bondage to finite existence, which is caused by our self-ignorance, our imaginary delusion that we are something other than the infinite and absolute reality, which is what we really are. Sri Ramana describes this state of mukti as being siddha, which means attained, because it is in truth our ever-existing or eternally attained natural state of being. Sri Ramana expresses the central idea in this verse in the form of a rhetorical question, a question whose answer is clearly implied in its wording. Since we can experience infinite and absolute happiness only in the perfectly peaceful state of liberation or true self-knowledge, the state in which all mental activity has ceased, it is obvious that we cannot experience such happiness if we allow our mind to be bound by the desire for any form of siddhi, supernatural or miraculous power of mind, because all such mental powers can be attained only by mental activity. So long as our mind is active, we cannot know our real self, which is perfectly peaceful and inactive being, because our mind becomes active only when we imagine ourselves to be the limited form of a particular body. When we do not imagine ourselves to be any body, as in sleep, all the restless activity of our mind subsides, and we remain peaceful and happily in the state of mere being. As soon as our mind rises, either in the state of waking or a state of dream, we imagine ourselves to be a body, and through the five senses of that body we see a world which we imagine to be separate from ourselves. Therefore, since all forms of dualistic knowledge and all forms of activity come into existence only when our mind rises, the rising of our mind obscures our natural state of peaceful, blissful, and inactive being, in which we experience only the non-dual knowledge of our own real self, I am. Since the appearance of this world in the waking state or of any other world in a dream is caused only by the rising of our mind, we cannot experience the peaceful non-dual state of true self-knowledge so long as we perceive this world. Therefore, in the third paragraph of Nānyā, Sri Ramana says, if our mind, which is the cause of all dualistic, relative, or objective knowledge and of all activity, subsides, becomes still, disappears, or ceases to exist, our perception of the world will cease, just as knowledge of the rope which is the base that underlies and supports the appearance of the snake will not rise unless knowledge of the imaginary snake ceases, swarupa darsana. True experiential knowledge of our own essential nature or real self, which is the base that underlies and supports the appearance of the world, will not arise unless our perception of the world, which is an imagination or fabrication, ceases. The world and everything else that we know, except our own real self, our non-dual consciousness of our own essential being, I am, is merely a figment of our imagination, a fabrication or illusion created by our own mind, which is the power of Maya, our delusive and self-deceiving power of imagination. Therefore, in the seventh paragraph of Nānyā, Sri Ramana says, that which actually exists is only Atma Svarupa, our essential self. The world, soul, and God, which are the three basic elements of finite existence, our imaginations or fabrications in it, our essential self, like the imaginary silver that we see in a shell. These three basic elements of relativity or duality appear at the same time, such as when we rise up from sleep, and disappear at the same time, such as when we subside in sleep. Our Svarupa, our own form or essential self alone, is the world, and our Svarupa alone is I, the consciousness that appears as our individual self, our mind or soul. Our Svarupa alone is God. Everything is Shiva Swarupa, our essential self, which is Shiva, the absolute and only true existing reality. Since our individual self or soul and the world and God, that is God as a separate entity that appear along with it, are all mere imaginations superimposed upon the one fundamental reality, which is our own real self. Their appearance prevents us from experiencing that reality as it actually is, that is, as our own, absolutely, inactive, non-dual, self-conscious being. Therefore, we cannot experience the true nature of our own real self unless we cease imagining the existence of any such form of duality or relativity. Any world that we may perceive is nothing but a series of mental images or thoughts that we form in our mind by our power of imagination. Since the world is therefore nothing but our own thoughts, and since the root of all our thoughts is our primary thought, I am this body, the appearance of the world, which includes the appearance of the body that we mistake to be ourself, obscures our true self-knowledge of ourself, our non-dual consciousness of our own essential being, I am. This process of obscuration is explained clearly by Sri Ramana in the fourth paragraph of Nānyā. That which is called mind is an Atisaya Sakti, an extraordinarily or wonderful power that exist in Atmasvarupa, our essential self. It projects all thoughts or causes all thoughts to appear. When we see what remains, having removed, relinquished, discarded, dispelled, erased, or destroyed all our thoughts, we will discover that solitarily, separate from or independent of thoughts, there is no such thing as mind. Therefore, thought alone is the svarupa, the own form or basic nature of our mind. Having removed all our thoughts, we will discover that there is no such thing as world, existing separately or independently as other than our thoughts. In sleep there are no thoughts, and consequently there is also no world. In waking and dream there are thoughts, and consequently there is also a world. Just as a spider spins out a thread from within itself and again draws it back into itself, so our mind projects this or some other world from within itself and again dissolves it back into itself. When our mind comes out from Atmasvarupa, our essential self, the world appears. Therefore, when the world appears, Svarupa, our own form or essential self, does not appear as it really is, that is, as the absolute and infinite non-dual consciousness of just being. When Svarupa appears, shines as it really is, the world does not appear. If we go on investigating the nature of our mind, Tan alone will finally appear as the one underlying reality that we now mistake to be our mind. That which is here called Tan, a Tamil reflexive pronoun meaning oneself or ourself, is only Atmasvarupa, our own essential self. Our mind stands only by always following, conforming, or attaching itself to a gross object, a physical body. Solitarily it does not stand. Our mind alone is spoken of as Sukshma Sarira, our subtle body. That is the subtle form or seat of all the imaginary physical bodies that our mind creates and mistakes to be itself, and as Jiva, our soul or individual self. The world that we imagine we perceive outside ourselves is in fact nothing but our own thoughts, a series of mental images that our mind projects from within itself and experiences within itself. It is therefore a creation and projection of our own mind, just like the world that we experience in a dream. Since our thoughts are the veil that obscures our true nature, which is perfect peace and happiness, our experience of thoughts and the world created by our thoughts is the real cause of all our unhappiness. As Sri Ramana says at the end of the 14th paragraph of Nanyar, a complete translation of which is given in the final pages of the first chapter. What is called the world is only thought. When the world disappears, that is, when thought ceases, our mind experiences happiness. When the world appears, it experiences unhappiness. The happiness that we experience when the world disappears, along with all our other thoughts, is our own real self, our essential being. Though Sri Ramana says that our mind experiences happiness when our thoughts cease, that which actually experiences happiness at that time is not our mind as such, but is only our true self, which is the sole reality underlying the false appearance of our mind. Our mind as such is only thoughts. In the absence of thoughts, what remains is not our mind, but only our own essential being, our pure self-consciousness I am, which is ever uncontaminated by any thought. So long as we attend to thoughts, our mind appears to exist. But when we turn our attention away from all thoughts to scrutinize the essential consciousness aspect of our mind, we will discover that our mind is truly not a separate entity, but is only our own real self, the nature of which is non-dual consciousness of being I am. This is what Sri Ramana means in the 4th paragraph of Nanyar, when he says cryptically, "If we go on investigating the nature of our mind, self alone will finally appear as our mind." The Tamil verb mudium, which I have here translated as will finally appear, literally means will end, but also has many other meanings such as will be accomplished, will be complete, or will appear. When he says self alone will end as mind, he means that when we persistently scrutinize the essential nature of our mind, we will finally discover that what now appears to be our mind is in fact nothing other than our real self, our fundamental consciousness of our own being, I am. He expresses this same truth in verse 17 of Upadesa Undiyar. When we scrutinize the form of our mind without forgetfulness, we will discover that there is no such thing as mind separate from or other than our real self. For everyone, this is the direct path, the direct means to experience true self-knowledge. We are nothing but pure and absolute consciousness. Not consciousness of anything other than ourself, but just consciousness of our own essential being, which we always experience as I am. When we imagine that we are conscious of anything other than I am, we appear to be our mind, a separate, object-knowing consciousness. But when we examine this consciousness that appears to know things other than itself, it will dissolve and disappear, and what will remain is only our true non-dual consciousness of being, because there is truly no such thing as mind other than our fundamental and essential self-consciousness I am. When our mind appears, the world appears along with it. The appearance of the world depends upon the appearance of our mind, but our mind cannot stand alone without a world. Whenever our mind appears, it does so by attaching itself to a physical body, which it mistakes to be itself. The body which we mistake to be ourself is a part of the world, but due to our identification of that one particular body as I, we create an artificial distinction between what we imagine to be ourself and what we imagine to be other than ourself. This false distinction is created by our mind, but without it, our mind cannot stand. Though the world is its own imaginary creation, our mind cannot imagine a world without simultaneously imagining itself to be a particular body in that world. That is why in the 4th paragraph of Nanyar, Sri Ramana says our mind stands only by always following, conforming or attaching itself to a gross object of physical body. Solitarily it does not stand. This is our experience in both waking and dream. We never experience our mind without feeling ourselves to be a particular body in a seemingly objective world. Therefore, Sri Ramana often described our mind as the consciousness, I am this body, for which he sometimes used the traditional Sanskrit term Dehatma Buddhi, which literally means body-self-sense. That is the sense, feeling, thought, or imagination that our body is ourself. He also says that our mind is what is called the Sukshma Sarira, or subtle body, because it is the seed or subtle form of all the imaginary physical bodies that it creates by its power of imagination and mistakes to be itself. Our imagining a particular body to be I is prerequisite to our perception of the world, because it is through the 5 senses of the body that we imagine to be ourself that we perceive the world. As Sri Ramana says, this world is projected by our mind, and in the process of this projection, the 5 senses of our body function like the lens in a cinema projector. Though we feel that we perceive the world through our 5 senses, we in fact not only perceive it, but also project it through our 5 senses. Just as thinking is a twofold process of forming and experiencing thoughts in our mind, so perception is a twofold process of projecting and experiencing the world. Forming a thought and experiencing it are not two separate actions, but are just two inseparable aspects of the single process of thinking. Similarly, projecting external objects and experiencing them are not two separate actions, but are just two inseparable aspects of the single process of perception. Thinking and perception are both processes of imagination. The only difference between them is that we recognize that the thoughts we think exist only in our mind, whereas we imagine that the world we perceive exists outside our mind. However, this distinction is not real, but exists only in our own imagination. In a dream, we imagine that the world we perceive at that time exists outside our mind. But when we wake up, we recognize that it actually existed only within our mind. The world that we perceive now in this so-called waking state is experienced by us in exactly the same manner that we experienced that world in our dream. So we have no valid or adequate reason to suppose that it is not merely a figment of our imagination, just as that other world was. In both waking and dream, we experience a body, which we mistake to be ourself. And then through the five senses of that body, we experience a world that seems to exist outside ourself. Whenever we experience a body as ourself and a world as existing outside ourself, whether in waking or in dream, that experience appears to us to be real. Only after waking up from a dream are we able to recognize without the least doubt that it was only a figment of our imagination, a projection of our own mind. In a dream, the body that we mistake to be ourself is a projection of our own mind. When we begin to dream, the first thing we do is simultaneously to imagine a body and to delude ourselves into experiencing that body as ourself. Without this self-induced delusion that an imaginary body is ourself, we could not experience the imaginary world that we perceive at that time. Whenever we perceive a world, we always do so from within the confines of a particular body, which we feel to be ourself. Hence, our perception of any world is dependent upon our imagining ourselves to be a body in that world, which in turn is dependent upon our mind, the finite consciousness that imagines itself to be that body. Therefore, in verses 5, 6, and 7 of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana says, "Our body is a form composed of 5 shis, the panchakosas or 5 adjuncts that seemingly cover and obscure our consciousness of our real self when we imagine any of them to be ourself. Therefore, all 5 of these shis or adjuncts are included in the term body. Without some kind of body, is there any such thing as a world? Say, having left all kinds of body, is there any person who has seen this or any other world? The world is nothing other than a form, composed of 5 kinds of sense perception: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Those 5 kinds of sense perception are objects known to our 5 sense organs. Since our mind alone cognizes the world through these 5 sense organs, say, without our mind, is there any such thing as a world? Though the world and our mind rise and subside as one, that is, together and simultaneously, the world shines or is known only by our mind. Only that, our own real self, which shines without ever appearing or disappearing, as the space or base for the reappearing and disappearing of the world and our mind, is Porul, the true substance, essence or absolute reality, which is the whole, the infinite totality of all that is. Sri Ramana begins verse 5 by saying that our body is a form composed of 5 sheaths, and that all these 5 sheaths are therefore included in the term body. As we saw, when we discussed the meaning of verse 22 of Upadesa Undiyar, in the final pages of the previous chapter, the Panchas Kosas, or 5 sheaths, are our physical body, the life force in our body, our mind, our intellect, and the darkness of relative ignorance that we experience in sleep. These 5 sheaths or adjuncts appear to obscure our natural consciousness of our real self because we imagine ourselves to be one or more of them in each of our 3 usual states of consciousness: waking, dream, and sleep. In waking and dream, we experience ourselves as a combination of 4 of our 5 sheaths: a physical body, the life in that body, our mind, and our intellect. And hence, through the 5 senses of our physical body, we experience a world of material objects. In sleep, on the other hand, we cease to experience ourselves as any of those outer 4 sheaths. Instead, we identify ourselves with our innermost sheath, which is a seeming darkness or ignorance, because we imagine ourselves to be unconscious of anything, and hence at that time we do not know any world other than that darkness. We perceive a physical world only when we imagine ourselves to be a physical body in that world. Therefore, in verse 5 of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana asks, without some kind of body, is there any such thing as a world? Say, having left all kinds of body, is there any person who has seen this or any other world? In verse 6, he points out the obvious truth that everything that we call the world is just a combination of the 5 types of sense perception: sights, sounds, smells, taste, and tactile sensations, which we experience through the medium of our 5 sense organs. However, that which actually experiences these 5 types of sense perception is only our mind. Therefore, Sri Ramana asked, since our mind alone cognizes the world through these 5 sense organs, say without our mind, is there any such thing as a world? That is, the appearance of any world depends not only upon our body, through the 5 senses of which we perceive, but also upon our mind, which is the consciousness that actually knows it. This dependence of the appearance of any world upon our mind is further emphasized by Sri Ramana in verse 7, in which he says, though the world and our mind rise and subside together, the world shines by our mind. What exactly does he mean by saying that the world shines by our mind? Here, the word olirum, or shines, means appears, becomes perceptible, or is known. That is, the world appears or is known only due to our mind, which is the consciousness that cognizes it. Any world appears or is known only when our mind attends to it. In our present waking state, this world appears because our mind attends to it, whereas in dream some other world appears because at that time our mind is attending to it. Therefore, our mind does not depend upon the appearance of any particular world, whereas the appearance of any particular world does depend upon our mind. Though the world and our mind both appear and disappear, underlying their appearance and disappearance is a reality that neither appears nor disappears. That reality is our own real self, our essential non-dual consciousness of our own being, which we always experience as I am. In both waking and dream, our mind appears along with the world, whereas in sleep our mind and all worlds disappear. However, in all these 3 states, we continue to experience ourselves as I am. Since our essential self-consciousness, our knowledge that we are, persists even in the absence of our mind, it is clearly more real than our mind, Since it transcends all the limitations that are experienced by our mind, it is not limited in any way, and hence it is both infinite and absolute. It is the one enduring reality, and hence it is the true substance that appears as our mind, our body, this world, and every other thing. Therefore, referring to our basic self-consciousness I am, which we experience continuously, Sri Ramana concludes verse 7 by expressing his own transcendent experience of true self-knowledge. Only that which shines without ever appearing or disappearing as the space or base for the appearing and disappearing of the world, and our mind is porul, the true substance, essence, or absolute reality, which is the whole, the infinite totality of all that is. Just as a rope appears to be a snake, without ever ceasing to be a rope, so our non-dual consciousness I am, which is the one absolute reality, appears as our mind, and all the duality experienced by our mind without ever ceasing to be what it really is. Sri Ramana summarizes the truth that he expresses in the above 3 verses of Uladu Narpadu and verse 99 of Guru Vachaka Kovai. This or any other world does not exist without a corresponding body that we imagine to be ourself. Any such body does not exist at any time without our mind. Our mind does not exist at any time without our essential consciousness. And our essential consciousness does not exist at any time without our true being, our own reality or emness. The existence of any world is dependent upon the body through which we perceive it. The existence of any such body is dependent upon our mind, which experiences it as I. The existence of our mind is dependent upon our essential consciousness, without which it could not know either its own existence or the existence of any other thing. How exactly does this sequence of dependence take place? Our real consciousness, that is, our basic consciousness I am, does not depend upon any other thing, because it always exists and knows its own existence. Our mind, on the other hand, does not always exist, or at least it does not always know its own existence. It knows its own existence only in waking and dream, but not in sleep. It appears to know its own existence only when it superimposes an imaginary body upon our real self-consciousness I am, thereby experiencing that body as I. And only after it has thus imagined itself to be a body is it able to experience a world through the 5 senses of that body. Therefore, the appearance of the world depends upon our body. The appearance of our body depends upon our mind, and the appearance of our mind depends upon our essential self-consciousness, I am. After expressing this sequence of dependence, Sri Ramana concludes by saying, consciousness does not exist at any time in the absence of being. By saying this, he does not mean to imply that consciousness is some separate thing that is dependent upon being, but only that consciousness itself is being. If consciousness were other than being, it would not be. That is, it would not exist, and hence it could not know either itself or any other thing. Similarly, if being were other than consciousness, it could not know itself, and hence it would have to depend upon some consciousness other than itself in order to be known. Hence, in order to be independently and therefore absolutely real, being must be conscious of itself, and consciousness must be. The real being is only our own being, because our being is self-conscious, whereas the seeming being, or existence of every other thing, is known only by us, and is therefore dependent upon us. Since our being is self-conscious, It is perfectly non-dual consciousness, and hence it is not dependent upon any other thing, either to be or to be known to be. Being completely independent, it is free from all forms of limitation, all conditions, and all relativity. It is therefore the one, infinite, and absolute reality. In this verse of Guru Vachaka Kovai, the word that I have translated as being is unmai, which usually means truth or reality, but which etymologically means isness or emness. Since real being or emness is self-conscious, it is not an objective form of being, but is the one infinite reality that underlies and supports the appearance of all objectivity or duality. It is the fundamental consciousness that makes the appearance of all other things possible. Since our mind, our body, this world, and every other conceivable thing depend upon our non-dual self-conscious being, and since they all appear and disappear, they are all mere imaginary appearances, and the sole reality that underlies and supports their appearance is only our own being or consciousness. In other words, the one substance that appears as everything is only our own essential being consciousness, I am. Whereas every other thing is only relatively real, being a mere imagination, our own consciousness is the one and only absolute reality. In essence, therefore, everything is only our own consciousness. Hence, our consciousness alone is real. Other than it, nothing truly exists. This is the final conclusion to which Sri Ramana leads us. However, understanding theoretically that everything is only our own consciousness is not an end in itself. Sri Ramana leads us to this conclusion in order to convince us that the only means by which we can experience the absolute reality is to experience ourself as the infinite non-dual consciousness of being that we really are. In order to experience ourself thus, we must divert our attention away from all other things and focus it wholly and exclusively upon ourself, that is, upon our own self-conscious being, which we always experience as I am. Our present knowledge of duality or otherness is what obstructs us from experiencing our own consciousness as the adjunct, free, and absolutely non-dual self-consciousness that it truly is. Since our knowledge of duality arises only when we imagine ourselves to be a body, we cannot experience ourselves as the infinite, undivided, non-dual, and absolute reality so long as we experience the seeming existence of any other thing. In order to remove our imaginary knowledge of duality, we must cease to imagine ourselves to be this or any other body. And in order to cease imagining ourselves thus, we must know ourselves as we really are. Our mind rises, imagining itself to be a body, and thereby experiencing things that appear to be other than itself, only because of our self-ignorance, and hence it will be destroyed only by our true knowledge. Our primal imagination that we are a physical body is the foundation upon which our mind is built. Whenever our mind rises, whether in a dream or in a so-called waking state, it always imagines itself to be a body. Without this fundamental imagination, I am this body, it could not rise and imagine any other thing. When our mind is active, perceiving the world or thinking thoughts, all of which pertain to the world in one way or another, we always feel, I am a person called so-and-so. I am distinct from this world around me, and from all the other people and creatures that I see in this world. And these feelings are all rooted in our fundamental imagination that a particular body is ourself. Whatever else we may be experiencing, this fundamental imagination I am this body, is always there in the background, underlying all our experiences. In our essential nature, we are just formless consciousness, and as such, we do not think any thoughts or experience anything other than I am. We experience this natural state of formless consciousness in deep sleep, which is a state in which we know nothing other than our essential being, I am. The fact that we can be and can know our being in the formless state of deep sleep clearly indicates that in our essential nature, we are not any form, but are just formless consciousness of being. Though we are formless consciousness, in the waking and dream states we imagine ourselves to be the form of a particular body. The form-bound consciousness that seemingly comes into existence when we thus attach ourselves to a body is what we call our mind. Our mind, which in reality is just formless consciousness, forms itself as a form-bound consciousness by imagining itself to be the form of a particular body. The basic form that our mind takes upon itself is its fundamental imagination, I am this body. This fundamental imagination is itself our mind. Other than this imagination, I am this body, our mind does not exist as a separate entity. Our mind arises only when it forms itself as this fundamental imagination, and only after forming itself thus does it begin to form all its other imaginations. Therefore, the root of all imagination is our primal imagination, I am this body. In the 5th paragraph of Nan-yar, Sri Ramana describes more about this primal imagination, I am this body, which he refers to as the thought I that rises in this body. What rises in this body is I, that alone is our mind. If we investigate in what place the thought I rises first in our body, we will come to know that it rises first in our heart, the innermost core of our being. That alone is the birthplace of our mind, even if we remain thinking I. It will take us and leave us in that place. Of all the thoughts that appear or arise in our mind, the thought I alone is the first thought. Only after this rises do other thoughts rise. Only after the first person appears do the second and third persons appear. Without the first person, the second and third persons do not exist. Though our body is an imagination, an image that our mind has formed within itself, our mind cannot rise without imagining this mental image to be itself. Such is the enigmatic nature of Maya, our self-deceptive power of imagination. Being a mental image, our body actually exists only in our mind. But we delude ourselves into imagining that our mind exists only within our body. As a result of this delusion, when our mind rises, we feel that it rises within the confines of our body. The limited feeling I that rises within this body, mistaking it to be itself, is our mind. Though this feeling I, which is a thought or mental image, seems to arise or originate within this body, if we scrutinize it keenly in order to ascertain from where in this body it originates, we will discover that it does not actually originate from any place within this body, but only from the innermost core of our being. In spiritual literature, this innermost core of our being, which is our fundamental and essential consciousness I am, is what is called our heart, Hridaya. As Sri Ramana often explained, the word heart in this context does not denote any organ within our body, but is synonymous with our real self, the formless and infinite spirit, which is the absolute reality and which we always experience as our fundamental consciousness of mere being, I am. Our fundamental consciousness I am is referred to as our heart, or the core of our being, because we experience it as the center from which we experience all other things. In every experience and every knowledge, our fundamental consciousness I am is present as both the center and the base. All our knowledge is based upon and centered in our first and fundamental knowledge I am. All our other forms of knowledge appear and disappear, but this knowledge of consciousness I am remains as our only constant and unchanging knowledge. It is therefore the heart, or core, of all that we consider to be ourself, and of all that we, as an individual, know, experience, and do. Because it is the source from which our mind and everything known by our mind arises, Sri Ramana says that our heart, or real self, is the birthplace of our mind. Though he uses the word place to denote the core or heart of our being, he does not use it in the literal sense of a place existing within the limited dimensions of time and space, but only in a figurative sense. That is, though the core of our being is not confined within the limits of time and space, he refers to it figuratively as a place, because we always experience it as the central point in time and space, as the now and here, the single point from which we perceive and conceive all other points in time and space. Some people appear to have difficulty in understanding the simple fact that our true being is formless and infinite consciousness, presumably because they are either unable or unwilling to conceive of any consciousness beyond their present finite consciousness of themselves as a physical body. Because they cannot conceive that they are anything more than their limited mind-body complex, and because some of them are therefore enamored by the idea of chakras or mystic centers located at certain points within the physical body. Such people often used to ask Sri Ramana at which point in the physical body the Hridaya, or spiritual heart, is located. Knowing that such people were unable or unwilling to comprehend the simple truth that the word heart truly denotes the infinite reality, the formless spirit of consciousness, Sri Ramana used to appease their curiosity by saying that the spiritual heart is located 2 digits to the right from the center of our chest. The reason why he specified this particular point as being the location of the heart in our physical body is that this is the point in our body at which our sense of I appears to originate and from which it spreads throughout our body. However, this location of our heart is not absolutely true, but is true only relative to our body. This location is only as real as our body, and our body is no more real than our mind, of which it is a creation. Since our body is a mere imagination, like the whole world of which it is a part, how can any point in it be our true heart, the core of our being, which is the infinite and absolute reality? Therefore, to all people who are able to understand this simple truth of his teaching, namely, that our essential self is the sole reality, and that our mind and everything known by it, except I am, is a mere figment of our self-deceiving imagination, Sri Ramana often emphasized the truth that the spiritual heart is not any place in our body, but is only our own real self, our fundamental and essential consciousness of being I am. Not only is the location of our spiritual heart in this physical body merely a relative truth, it is also a truth which is of no practical value. When someone once asked him whether we should meditate on the right side of our chest in order to meditate upon our spiritual heart, he replied, "The heart is not physical. Meditation should not be on the right or on the left. Meditation should be on the self. We all know I am. What is this I? It is neither inside nor outside, nor is it on the right or on the left? I am. That is all. For the practical purposes, all we need know about the spiritual heart is that it is our basic consciousness I am, which is the core of our being and the center of all that we experience. In this 5th paragraph of Nanyar, Sri Ramana teaches that the means by which we can experience a clear knowledge of this heart, which is the source or birthplace of our mind, is to keenly scrutinize our primal thought I in order to ascertain from which place or from what it has originated. Though he expresses this process of self-investigation or vichara by saying, if we investigate in what place the thought I rises first in our body, we will come to know that it rises first in our heart. That alone is the birthplace of our mind. This is essentially the same process that he expresses more directly in the 6th paragraph, which we cited in full earlier in this chapter by saying, if we investigate who am I, our mind will return to its birthplace. Our mind or attention returns to its source or birthplace, the innermost core of our being, whenever we cease thinking of anything other than our own essential self-conscious being, which we always experience as I am. Our mind rises from its source only by thinking, that is, by imagining and attending to anything other than itself. So it naturally subsides and merges in its source whenever it stops thinking. This subsidence and merging of our mind in our essential being happens every day when we fall asleep. However, in sleep we do not experience a clear, unclouded knowledge of our true being, because we subside in sleep only by withdrawing our attention from other things, but without focusing it keenly upon our own consciousness of being, our essential self-consciousness, I am. Our mind rises due to the cloud of self-forgetfulness or self-ignorance with which we have seemingly obscured our natural clarity or pure self-consciousness. We mistake ourselves to be this finite body-bound consciousness called mind only because we have chosen seemingly to ignore our true being, the infinite and uncontaminated consciousness I am. This voluntary self-ignorance or self-forgetfulness persists until we choose to remember what our true being really is. We can remember what we really are only by focusing our attention wholly and exclusively upon our essential being, our consciousness I am, because the true nature of our essential being is pure, non-dual self-consciousness. Since we subside and merge in the state of sleep without focusing our attention wholly and exclusively upon our essential consciousness of being I am, the cloud of our self-ignorance or self-forgetfulness continues to exist in sleep. The ordinary sleep that we experience every day is just a state in which our mind rests from its ceaseless activity and recuperates its energy to engage in more activity. By temporarily merging and becoming one with its original source, which is the true source of all power, our mind is able to recharge its energy, which it then expends on another bout of activity either in waking or dream. Having expended its limited supply of energy, our mind must again merge in sleep to renew that supply. No machine can gain energy merely by ceasing to be active. We cannot recharge a battery simply by ceasing to use it for a while. In order to recharge it, we have to connect it to some source of power, such as the mains electricity or a generator. Likewise, our mind does not renew its energy in sleep merely because it is inactive. It does so because in sleep it is connected to a source of power, which is our own essential being. The power that our mind derives by remaining for a while in sleep does not come from anywhere outside ourself. It comes only from a source within ourself, and that source is our own real self or spirit, the essential nature of which is our mere consciousness of being, our self-consciousness I am. In sleep, all that we experience is I am, but by merely experiencing this consciousness I am for a while, our mind is able to recharge its energy. However, though we do experience the knowledge I am in sleep, we do not experience it with perfect clarity. Though our mind has subsided in sleep together with all its knowledge of other things, the clouding influence of our basic self-forgetfulness persists. Therefore, though in sleep we know that we do not clearly know what we are. The reason why we do not clearly know what we are in sleep is that we subside in that state merely by withdrawing our attention from other things, but without focusing it upon ourself. In order to know what we are, we must focus our attention keenly upon our own essential being. This focusing of our attention wholly and exclusively upon ourself, our consciousness of being I am, is what Sri Ramana calls self-investigation or Atma-Vichara. Sri Ramana describes this simple process of self-investigation in various different ways, each of which is suited to a particular context. In the 6th paragraph of Nanyar, in the context of how we should deal with other thoughts which tend to distract us whenever we try to attend to our mere being, he describes it as a process of investigating. To whom do these thoughts occur? To me. Who am I? In the 5th paragraph, in the context of how our mind always rises as a limited sense of I that is seemingly confined within a body, he describes it as a process of investigating in what place the thought I rises first in our body. Because our mind always rises in a body by imagining that body to be I, Sri Ramana says that we should investigate in what place it rises in our body. However, he explains that when we do so, we will discover that it does not actually rise from any place within our physical body, but only from our heart, the non-physical core of our being. In order to ascertain from where our mind rises as I, we must focus our attention keenly upon the essential consciousness that we experience as I. When we do so, our attention will automatically be withdrawn from our body and from everything else, and we will be centered entirely in our basic sense of being, our own fundamental self-consciousness I am. Therefore, by suggesting that we investigate from where, in this body, our mind rises as I, Sri Ramana is providing us with a trick to divert our attention away from our body towards the essential consciousness that, when seemingly contaminated with our cognition of this body and the world that we perceive through it, enables us to feel that this body is I. In whatever way he may describe this process of self-investigation or self-scrutiny, the sole aim of Sri Ramana is to provide us with clues that will help us to divert our attention away from our thoughts, our body, and all other things, and to focus it wholly and exclusively upon our fundamental and essential consciousness of being, which we always experience as I am. In his writings and sayings, there are many examples of how he does this. In this 5th paragraph of Nanyar, for instance, after first suggesting that we should investigate in what place the thought I rises in our body, he goes on to give us a still simpler means by which we can consciously return to the source from which we have risen, saying, even if we remain thinking I, it will take us and leave us in that place. He expresses this same truth in slightly different words in verse 716 of Guru Vachaka Kovai. Even if we incessantly contemplate that divine name I, or I am I, with our attention thereby fixed firmly in our heart, or that is, in our real I, which is the core of our being, it will save us, taking one that is ourself into the source from which our mind or thought rises in such a manner as to destroy our ego, which is the body-bound embryo, germ, cause, or foundation from which all other things rise. In this verse, the words, that name, refer to the name I am, or I am I, which he declared in the preceding verses, 712 to 715, to be the original and most appropriate name of God. When we contemplate this name I, our attention will be drawn to our basic self-consciousness, which we always experience as I am, and thereby our mind will be drawn back to its own source. When our mind or ego thereby sinks back into our real self, which is the source from which it had risen, it will be destroyed, being consumed in the infinite clarity of unadulterated self-consciousness. Since our mind deludes us, causing us to imagine ourselves to be bound within the limitations of a physical body, the destruction of our mind in the clear light of true self-knowledge is the only real salvation. And hence Sri Ramana says that we will be saved by contemplating upon the original name of God, which is I am, or I am I. Sri Ramana describes our mind as un arkaru ahandai, which means the ego, which is the body-bound embryo, because it comes into existence only by imagining itself to be a body, and because it thereby gives rise to the appearance of all other things. The Tamil word karu, which I have translated as embryo, also means germ, efficient cause, substance, or foundation, and it derives from the Sanskrit word garbha, which means womb, or the interior. In this context, therefore, it implies that our ego or mind is the embryo or seed, from which all duality or otherness is born, the substance of which it is formed, the active cause or creator that brings it all into being, the foundation that supports its appearance, and the womb inside which it is all contained. Since our body and all other things are imaginary appendages that distract our attention away from our essential self-consciousness, I am, we can free ourselves from them only by keeping our attention fixed firmly upon our self-consciousness. A simple and easy means by which we can draw our attention back towards our self-consciousness, and which will help us to a certain extent to keep it fixed there, is to remember the name I, or I am, incessantly. This is a very practical clue given to us by Sri Ramana, and it is particularly useful for those people who initially have difficulty in understanding what exactly is meant by the term self-attention. Such people are so accustomed to objective attention that they cannot understand how we can attend to our non-objective and formless consciousness, I am, and hence they complain that they cannot find any such thing as I to attend to. Because they imagine that they must first look for an I, as if it were some kind of subtle object, they complain that it is too elusive for them to be able to attend to. The real cause of their imagined difficulty, however, is that our consciousness I is not an object of any kind, but is the subject that knows all objects. We cannot objectify our first-person consciousness I, and if we try to do so, we will be diverting our attention away from the real I that we should be attending to. Though our consciousness I am is not an object, it is nevertheless something that we always know. None of us doubt the obvious truth I am, even though we do not have a perfectly clear knowledge of what exactly this I am is. Since many people experience such difficulty in grasping exactly what Sri Ramana means when he says that we should attend to our mere consciousness I am, he sometimes suggested that they should continuously think I, or I am. If we think thus, our attention will naturally be drawn back to the consciousness that is denoted by the words I and I am. Whenever we think of the name of a person or an object, a remembrance of that person or object naturally comes to our mind. The thought of any name will bring to our mind the form or thing denoted by that name. Likewise, the thought of the name I or I am will draw our attention to the subject, the non-objective consciousness denoted by that name. Therefore, thinking I is a useful aid to the practice of self-attention, at least until such time as we become familiar with the experience of attending to our mere consciousness of being. However, since even the verbalized thought I or I am is an object known by us, the practice of thinking I or I am can become a distraction, preventing our attention from penetrating deep into the consciousness that is actually denoted by the words I or I am. This practice of thinking continuously I is therefore beneficial only to a certain extent, but it will drop off naturally when it has become unnecessary, that is, when we have become sufficiently accustomed to the experience of our true self-attention. However, even when we have become accustomed to attending to our mere being, we may sometimes find that thinking I or I am a few times can be an aid to divert our attention away from other thoughts and to center it exclusively upon our own essential self-conscious being. In this extremely valuable small treatise, Nanyar, Sri Ramana has given us many other clues that can help us to practice self-attention. For example, in the 11th paragraph, when describing how we must overcome all our Vishaya vasanas, our deeply rooted mental impulsions or desires, to attend to things other than our own real self, he says, if one clings firmly to uninterrupted svarupa smarana, remembrance of one's own essential nature or real self I am, until one attains svarupa, that is, until one attains true knowledge of one's own essential nature, that alone will be sufficient. In plain English, the Sanskrit term svarupa smarana can best be translated as self-remembrance, which is just another way of describing the state of self-attention. However, every word has its own particular flavor, and by using the word smarana, or remembrance in this context, Sri Ramana is able to convey a shade of meaning that would not have been conveyed if he had instead used the word attention. The word remembrance suggests something that we already know, but have forgotten or overlooked. We always know I am, but we somehow overlook or ignore it because we are too enthralled by the delusive attraction of other things. If we wish to free ourselves of the bondage of attachment to anything other than our own real self, all we need do is to remember uninterruptedly our essential consciousness of being I am. Since our self-forgetfulness is the root cause of all our unhappiness and all our other problems, self-remembrance is the only antidote that will cure all our problems. Moreover, whereas terms such as self-investigation, self-examination, self-inquiry, self-scrutiny, and self-attention tend to suggest an active process of investigating, examining, inquiring into, scrutinizing, or attending to ourself, the term self-remembrance tends to suggest a more passive state of simply remembering ourself. All these words do, of course, denote the same process or state which is not actually a process of doing anything, but is only a state of just being. However, though they all denote the same state of just being, each of them depicts that state in a subtly different manner. So Sri Ramana used whichever term was most appropriate to the context in which he was speaking. Another two terms that he often used to denote this same state of just being were Atmanishta, which means self-abidance, and Atma Chintana, which literally means self-thought, or the thought of ourself. The first of these two terms, self-abidance, is particularly significant because it implies the truth that attending and knowing ourself is not an action, but is just the state of consciously abiding as our real self, or in other words, simply being what we really are, which is perfectly thought-free, self-conscious being. However, the other term, self-thought, could easily be mistaken to imply that self-attention is an act of thinking of ourself. Though these two terms seem to imply conflicting meanings, Sri Ramana uses both of them in the first sentence of the 13th paragraph of Nanyar, in the context of describing the state of complete self-surrender. Being completely absorbed in Atmanishta, self-abidance, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any thought except Atma Chintana, the thought of our own real self, is giving ourself to God. The reason why he uses the term Atma Chintana, or self-thought, in this context is to emphasize the fact that in order to abide in the state of perfect self-surrender, we should not attend to or think of anything other than our own essential being, I am. If we think of anything else, we rise as this separate, object-knowing consciousness that we call our mind. Thinking is therefore what separates us from God. Hence, if we truly wish to surrender our individual self or mind entirely to God, we must refrain from thinking anything. Why then does Sri Ramana say except Atma Chintana in this sentence? He makes this exception because Atma Chintana, or self-thought, is not actually a thought like any other thought that we think. Thinking of anything other than our true self is an action, and as such it requires the rising of our mind or individual self to perform that action, whereas thinking of our true self is not an action. When we try to think of our true self, our attention turns inwards towards our essential self-conscious being, and thus our mind subsides in the source from which it originated. This subsidence of our mind in the innermost core of our being I am, which is the true form of God, is the state of true and perfect self-surrender.